part of the reason of the Christ at the Checkpoint Conference was to hear their perspective. Now,
okay, describe a little bit about perspective to us. What do you feel are some of those complaints and some of that pain? What does it consist of?
Okay, so let me frame it this way, because I think this is a more helpful way to frame it. So you have this wall, and if you've been to the Middle East and you've seen the wall separating Israel from the Palestinian territories.
Kind of a sinister wall, in my opinion.
Yes.
It stands like a mole.
Yeah.
It's a symbol of the entire nature of this conflict. So
yes.
dark and violent.
It is, and so oppressive, and so different people's viewpoint of that wall, and even interpreting it, is this security fence or wall, or is it a separation barrier? You know, so. But there's a Messianic Jewish brother that I read, and I like the way that he says it. So let me just read this quote. He says, there are several separation barriers dividing us. And when he says dividing us, he's speaking primarily between Messianic Jews and Palestinian Christians. He says, there are several separation barriers dividing us, which sometimes feel just as tangible as the one made of wire and concrete and snaking through the West Bank. And then he lists three: entrenched conflicting narratives, the idealization of victimhood, and theological inhibitors to reconciliation. So those three things. So you have the wall, and on one side of the wall you have a historical narrative, the Jewish historical narrative. On the other side you have a Palestinian historical narrative. On one side of the wall you have the victimization stories on the Jewish, the Israeli perspective, and then you have the victimization story on the Palestinian perspectives. And then you have theological understanding on the Israeli, and if we're talking about followers of Jesus, so the Messianic Jewish theological perspective, and then the Palestinian Christian theological perspective. The problem is that because of that wall, there isn't space for people to come together to have conversations. So I'm not saying that we just need to hear the historical narrative and the victimization stories of the Palestinian side and the theology of the Palestinian side. I'm saying we need to hear the perspectives of both sides on those issues. So on the on the Israeli side, the historical narrative is the big part of the historical narrative for the Jews is the Holocaust, and their existential realities of people wanting to wipe them off the face of the earth. And so I am not minimizing that at all. There are people who would like to push them in the Mediterranean or blow them off the face of the map and stuff like that. So that's like reality. And so, but if you are only hanging around with people who are reinforcing your historical narrative, and part of that historical narrative is also to rehearse the victimization on your side, that is reality, that there is victimization, and also to reinforce your theological understanding, and you're never exposed to the other side, the historical narrative of the other side, the victimization stories of the other side, and the theological perspective of the other side, then you're just speaking to the choir. And so what I'm advocating for is really for creating an environment where we can have these meaningful conversations with an eye toward reconciliation. So that's the larger kind of umbrella or frame that I'd like to put around it. Now I can go to speak on the Palestinian side of try to represent some of that, if you'd like me to go there.
Yeah, no, I think we can go anywhere really that will clarify the issue. One question that I would have, let's focus on the wall, as you're saying yourself. And for a moment, I think I discern the despair of the Israelis who put that wall up, knowing that as they put that wall up, the world would be reminded of those walls that contained them in the concentration camps. That's really the association that I have immediately. Yeah. When I've been to Israel and I see that immense wall, immediately the association that comes in is the concentration camps, and how it might seem to individuals observing from the outside, wow, now the Jews are doing the same thing to the Palestinians that the Germans, Nazis, did to them. They're also putting a wall and they are oppressing. And I think the association is so natural that for the Israelis to do that, they must have known the moral cost and the symbolic consequences of putting up that wall. So immediately to my mind comes this idea that, wow, why would they be willing to incur that kind of damage to their cause by adding to the fuel of this image of them as oppressors of the Palestinians? And I think Israelis would respond. It was due to our despair because of all the terrorism that was taking place, all the terrorist attacks, people coming into Jerusalem, blowing themselves off, killing dozens and dozens of our people, the terror that struck. Yeah. We know that Jerusalem is a very small city, so is Israel as a whole. So that anything that happens is like happening between Newton, Cambridge, and a couple of other towns, you know, and that's about it. And so you can imagine. And so, you know, Israelis might say, well, you know, we did it out of absolute despair. We did it because our people were being blown up, and because it was the only recourse left to us. And they might say, and the fact is that once we put that wall up, terrorism and you know, people blowing up our city almost stopped completely. So, you know, it is justifiable. It's not that we wanted to do it, but we did it because we absolutely had to do it. And the results have been exactly what we needed to have. So that all of a sudden, you know, there is that other very practical dimension that emerges. And it's not just these people who want to contain and isolate and oppress, but rather we have to survive. How does your perspective respond to that kind of consideration? What would you say?
Yeah, so I'd say, first of all, there are a lot of different viewpoints on the wall, but I would say what you're saying is very true. And at the same time, there are folks who say that every day there are probably thousands and thousands of Palestinians that are able to make it through that wall one way or the other. And so it hasn't impeded. I mean, it's not a thing that's impeded Palestinian movement through the wall altogether. And so again, I just heard different perspectives on the wall, and so I don't know. I don't have a strong opinion, but I certainly resonate with what you're saying. But then you also have the issue of where the wall is, and so there's been a lot of debate and conversation around this. And if you've walked on both sides of the wall, and I don't know if you have had the opportunity to do that, and to see the root of the wall, and this kind of goes to the issue of, you know, whose land it is and stuff like that. So you know, anybody has the right to build a fence on their property. But when you build a fence on somebody else's property, and I know this gets to a whole theological point and stuff like that, but you see some, and I've walked that wall, you know, a number of times, and seeing the different route that it isn't on the agreed upon, you know, green line, that it goes over into orchards and all kinds of things, and this has fueled a lot of animosity. Because here's where the justice issue is. People, Palestinian and in some cases Palestinian Christians who had possessed that land for generations and had orchards and olive groves that they loved, and then to have this you know,
I
land.
understand. It must fuel a huge amount of indignation and a sense of anger.
Yes.
You know, the violation of their, you know, perceived rights. Let's talk a little bit about the land, because that's another issue that's really crucial in this whole dialogue. Much of the conflict is really around this issue of, do Jews and Israelis have this biblical right to the land? And I don't know that Israelis, being a secular society, and I think that's the dilemma.
Yes.
That is the dilemma and the hypocrisy of the Israeli state that I, as a concerned Christian, discern, which is that for Israel, it's very convenient to play the card of Abrahamic right and inheritance to the land. And really, that is ultimately probably the only strong argument that they have in an international dialogue of justice and laws and so on, to neutralize the fact that if you were to look at it in purely geographical, territorial, historical terms, it's very difficult to justify Israel saying, you know, the entire land is ours. So they have to somehow subtly appeal to this link to the land through the Bible and so on and so forth. And yet, at the same time, in their politics and in their cultural traits, they deny that, because Israel is a very secular nation, and it's a humanistic nation, and very liberal in its morals and so on and so forth. So it's kind of like they're playing both sides. I see that as an inconsistency at the very least.